Well, I appreciate the opportunity this afternoon to share just a few uh, pieces of the work we've done looking at alternatives to fallow. Um, you guys have probably seen bits and pieces of this over the years at various county level meetings or cover your acres, but kind of brought all this back together. And the one thing I don't have in here much, what we won't talk much about today, that is another viable alternative is forages. Most of what I'm going to talk about is focused on grain crops, but I certainly want to recognize John Holman at Garden City and Augustine DeBoer at Hayes have done a lot of work looking at forages, either as a cover crop or fallow alternative, or however you want to term that. And if that's something that's a fit in your operation, we can get that information to you, or potentially that's an idea for another webinar sometime in the future. So, but anyways, going to give an overview of several different things that we've looked at. Some things we've got a lot more research background and data on than others, but we'll kind of go through that. So on the visual here, this is a picture of the main dryland station at Tribune, which is one of many of the locations where we've done this work. But really, it's a lot of our data out Tribune that gives us a good understanding of what our fallow efficiencies are in this environment, where there might be opportunities to further intensify our rotations. And so I don't need everyone that's on the webinar probably realizes, this really strong precipitation gradient we're on really drives what we can do from a cropping system standpoint. Now, fortunately, under most of Western Kansas, we got the soils that really allow us to do some efficient things with our water. So unfortunately, I cannot get the polling feature to work here this morning. But anyways, what we want to do is just think a little bit about what percentage of dryland acres are in fallow, and certainly I think we've seen a trend here in recent years to where we've seen declining acres in fallow. Part of that's been helped by some wetter years. If we think about the last 5-10 year history, we've had some decent moisture at times in there. Higher commodity prices that have pushed that as well, and improved management and seeing how far can we push our systems further forward. So, anyways, that was a question we were going to ask. We're pretty sensitive to the economics of this. If any of you made it to my talk at Cover Your Acres, we talked a lot specifically about no-till versus reduced-till management in fallow, and basically, looking at our long-term responses at Tribune that show a really clear benefit to no-till. We kind of looked at the economics of, well, how much can I afford to spend to stay in no-till and still have an economic advantage over a reduced-till system. So we looked at that. That's really driven, by sorghum price is a real driver of that if we think about a wheat sorghum fallow system. But certainly if we look at the challenges in our herbicide-resistant weeds, the cost of what it's taking to maintain those, I think we all acknowledge that anything we could do to reduce fallow costs generally would be a pretty advantageous proposition. So how did we get here? I think it's important to remember that fallow is not originally part of our cropping systems in the Great Plains. If you look at what was going on in this region from when this ground was first brought into production, really fallow did not come into widespread use until later on in the 20s and 30s. It's interesting looking at the historical studies and records here at Colby. There was a lot of effort put into evaluating fallow versus continuous cropping, really, in the late 19 teens on up through the 20s. And so it really came about later, especially with the advent of tractor power, having that ability to actually to do summer fallow, mechanization allowed that to happen. And really, I'd make the argument, there's reasons fallow came into vogue. You could actually make the argument it was kind of the first form of crop insurance, and that was the use of fallow, minimize some of that variability in our wheat yields, even though, yes, we was only growing wheat on half the acres, but it was a more consistent crop. Again, keep in mind, before the days of nitrogen fertilizer. And so, basically that mineralization of organic matter by working the ground, provided the nitrogen fertility that our crops needed. Now, unfortunately, we burned up a lot of organic matter in the process of doing that, but at the time, that was our best management option. Okay, so the thing we keep in mind, and a term we use when when we're evaluating our dryland cropping systems, is precipitation use efficiency. And so basically, how much grain did we raise with the precipitation that we received in the entire cropping system? And so that's not just in-season precip, but also the precipitation that would have fell in that fallow period preceding the crop. And really, there's two ways to improve that. Well, obviously, we can grow a crop in place of fallow, and probably the best example, the biggest example we have of that, if you've looked at how the High Plains region over the last 40 years has really transitioned from wheat fallow as a main rotation to something else, typically wheat summer crop fallow, so wheat sorghum fallow, wheat corn fallow, wheat millet fallow, etc. So grow a crop and place that fallow. And this was a very key thing, because also it's about thinking about when are our water resources available to us? Well, what's our biggest months for precipitation out here in the rain shadow of the Rockies? Well, it's typically April, May, June, or sometimes May, June, July, depending upon the year. And so if you think about that old wheat fallow system, with most of our precip coming in April, May, June, we've got a lot of acres sitting out there that are sitting fallow. We've got fairly low storage efficiencies, and so we're forfeiting some really valuable precipitation. So that's why it was easy to make that step to a wheat sorghum fallow, wheat corn fallow, stick a spring crop out there that can utilize that in-season precip. The other thing we can do is improve fallow efficiency. We've done a lot of that over the years, moving towards no-till, keeping more residue on the ground, anything to reduce those evaporative losses and let us hold on to a larger percentage of that rainfall that we're receiving during the fallow period. So how do we actually quantify these things? So fallow accumulation, that's simply just a change in water in soil water from the beginning of the fallow period to the end. So we look at that in all of our studies, or all of our big rotation studies. How much water did we accumulate during that fallow period? And then the efficiency is just looking at, okay, how much water did we store divided by how much rain did we get? That's going to give us a percentage of fallow efficiency. What percent of the rain that fell during the fallow period did we actually bank into the water, or into the soil? So what are factors that drive fallow efficiency? Well, let's think about, water is leaving the system in one of two ways during this fallow period. It's either through poor weed control and transpiration, losing that water through weeds, or evaporative losses. And so, weed control, there's a lot from a management standpoint there, use of pre-emerge residual herbicides early in the fallow period, et cetera, all those things we've talked about this winter at the weed schools. But then evaporative losses is the other main thing we can affect through management. So thinking about the size of our precip events, and then what can we do from a surface residue and tillage standpoint. I think this is interesting to think about. So this is at Tribune, this being a wheat fallow system. So this is in that long fallow. What percent of our precipitation comes in these different size rainfall events? And what's interesting is almost 25% of our annual precip at Tribune, and Colby does not differ much from this, almost 25% of our total precip is coming in rainfall events that are 1 to 2 inches in size. Okay. And so this comes back to, from a management standpoint, this is the importance of infiltration rates, better soil aggregates. Those are a lot of those benefits we capture through no-till, being able to infiltrate that water into the ground. But then really, once you get beyond that category, everything else is pretty evenly distributed. We get about 8% of our rain comes in events larger than 2 inches. But then the rest of it's kind of basically even out, and if you look at these 1/10 increment, from an inch on down, pretty evenly distributed, about 10% each. But if you think about the 0 to 10 hundredths and 11 to 20 hundredths, we're talking about 16-17% of our rain is coming in these events that are smaller than 20 hundredths. And so that's where evaporation comes into play. These down here are essentially worth zero from a cropping standpoint. We're not going to store those types of events. Doesn't change a whole lot when we look at a shorter fallow period, like in a wheat sorghum fallow type system. Pretty much a very similar type distribution. Okay, this is another poll question that was supposed to work, but again, thinking about that mix out there of no-till, reduced till, so using some combination of tillage and herbicide, conventional till, and or all the above, and certainly over recent years we've seen a migration of acres from no-till to reduced till, and that's where we in other presentations we've talked about what are the trade-offs there, and certainly we've got data at Tribune that shows we probably give up sorghum yield. We are giving up sorghum yield as we make that transition from no-till to reduced till. But on the other hand, we also have some data and some occasional tillage studies that shows, at least so far, we can typically make one pass of the sweeps during fallow and not give up all those benefits of no-till. But a big driver here is, again, this if we've got some moisture and we're out there doing tillage, how much do we lose in evaporation? So this is work that was done by ARS USDA out at Akron, Colorado. They decided to revisit this. This was actually looked at in the 60s or 70s in a trial, and some people often gave pushback that the losses really couldn't be that high. So they decided to revisit this trial in 2012, and interestingly got essentially the same numbers that was observed in the late 60s. And so this is just looking at moisture loss in inches. Again, this is assuming we've got some moisture in the soil to begin with, but how much moisture is lost out of the top 6 inches, and then 6 to 12 inches in the first 2 days after a tillage event. So, not surprisingly, moldboard plow, fortunately, that practice has largely went away. But sweeping ground that's already been swept or has a low level of surface residue, we're talking about a 1/2 inch of water loss out of that top 6 inches after a sweep operation. If we got a little more residue out there, maybe we can cut that back to about 4/10 of an inch. And yet at the same time, we've got some real low rates of evaporation, a couple hundredths of an inch occurring out of the no-till over that same 2-day time period. Okay. So yeah, we're going to move ahead here. These are some more poll questions we had. Just again, looking at the value of residue, keeping some wheat stubble out there really improves, or corn sorghum residue really improves our storage efficiency. So this is looking at bare soil condition on up to about 10,000 pounds. This happens to be wheat stubble. If you look at down at Bushland, Texas, which is down by Amarillo, basically saw precipitation storage efficiencies go from about 23% to as high as 45%. And that's in line with what we see at Tribune in our long-term studies in a wheat sorghum fallow under no-till, high levels of residue. We can get to that 40-45% storage efficiency, but we can also be as low as 20% on the poorer side of things as well. Yeah, that's just another way of looking at that, from row crop harvest to wheat seeding. So this is, typically when we're thinking about fallow alternatives, this is the hole we're trying to fill is, so we're looking at this, our efficiency for these different points in time. So from row crop harvest through July of the fallow period, about 28-29% efficient. From July of that summer fallow period up through wheat planting, we actually have negative efficiency. We actually lose more water out of the fallow than what we get in rainfall. And so over that entire time period from row crop harvest through wheat planting, we're at about 21% efficiency in terms of fallow efficiency. And this is, again, in a no-till system. If we're doing some tillage during that fallow period, this number is probably going to dip down closer to that 16-17% range. But this is the hole we're thinking about plugging, is with a fallow alternative crop. So where do we go from here? Well, we know we're leaving water on the table. So just back to the previous slide, if we just use 20% as a round figure, and typically in that fallow period from row crop harvest to wheat planting the next year, we're averaging about 15.5 inches of precip. So that's using, that means we're only storing about 3-4 inches of water in the fallow, which means we're leaving over 12 inches of water on the table. And so what can we do with that? We know that reducing soil water at planting, though, will impact subsequent crops. If we mine too much of the profile water, we know we are going to, if we stay in that, wheat row crop, some alternative type rotation coming back to wheat, we know we're going to ding those wheat yields if we mine profile water too hard. So, and we know we don't want to reduce our wheat yields too much. That gives us poor quality stubble, which hurts the yield potential then of our row crop, which is often the one paying the bills. And so, how do we strike that? How do we strike that balance? So some things we've looked at in recent years. We've looked at safflower. We've looked at winter and spring field pea, spring wheat. We've just recently started some work in cowpeas or black-eyed peas. I mentioned John and Augustine's work in forages. And then we'll visit just a brief moment about camelina and canola and some of the brassica oilseed crops as well. Okay, so winter and spring pea in Kansas. This is work we started in 2009. Just to kind of give you some framework for field peas. So they're an indeterminate cool season crop. Their growth temperatures, their optimum temperature is about 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Their minimum temperature at which they grow is 50. Maximum temperature. So again, think about how we calculate GDUs for corn or sorghum. We've got that for corn or sorghum, we max out at 86 degrees. For peas, we max out at 73. We really get no additional benefit to plant growth at temperatures above that. And in fact, these temperatures can become damaging at 82 to 90 degrees. And then we can cause permanent damage to pollen and the ovules if we're in that flowering stage at temperatures of 95 degrees. And these pieces down here really have been our challenge for consistently growing peas in our environment. Again, they're a cool season crop. And that's one of the challenges we have with using cool season crops as a fallow alternative is, so this would be true for our spring peas. This is true for spring wheat, spring canola. These crops are entering their flowering, reproductive flowering and grain fill stages during a period of time where we can often have our first set of 95, 100-degree days with 35-mile-an-hour wind. And so that's a real challenge on some of these cool season alternative crops. Okay, so I want to point out that there's winter and spring peas, and our work started with springs. However, in our environment and where we're probably focusing more of our efforts going forward is going to be on the winter side of things. So you're all familiar, typically, winter wheat versus spring wheat. The winter means there's a vernalization requirement. So we've got to have that seed below some threshold temperature for a number of days to flip some biochemical switches so that when it greens up, when it comes out of dormancy, further on in its growth cycle, it can actually go into reproductive stages, stem elongation and reproductive. So in peas, that's not the case. It's not really a vernalization thing. It's more about winter hardiness. It's more about getting that plant to survive through the winter. Winter types tend to be more photoperiod sensitive than the spring types, which makes a difference in how they progress in the spring. And much like winter wheat, winter peas, they have a cold acclimation process. So once we start, you can kind of think of it as like a reverse heat unit. And so we start accumulating, once we're below the threshold temperature, we kind of start accumulating these cool heat units. And that signals the plant to start accumulating solutes, kind of basically start manufacturing its own antifreeze, if you will, in the plant. Very similar to what we've talked about over the years in winter wheat and that winter hardening process. Also starts to put more of its growth into below ground roots as opposed to above ground biomass. So we talked about some photoperiod sensitivity. So a winter pea typically will not flower any earlier than April 25th at Colby. So we kind of got that time period in there. We see some big differences in seed size. Spring peas tend to be a larger sized pea as opposed to winter. We think about that germination process. This one, from a management standpoint, this is really important. Seed doubles in volume in the first 2 days of germination. So just think about, pea versus wheat. It requires about 3 times the moisture for germination. So you think about that seed, or think about a soybean seed, a lot more surface area there, a lot more water needs to be imbibed for that germination process. So the important management note with this is on peas, we want to plant them at least a half inch into moisture to make sure we've got enough water to complete that process. The absolute worst thing we can do with peas is go out there and lay them right on the wet dry interface, because you often get enough moisture to start that germination process, but not enough to finish it, and then it dies with no emergence. So we can plant these peas pretty deep. We can go 3.5 inches and have no problems. It takes them longer to emerge, but if that's what we got to do to get into moisture, we've got the ability to do that, which is a big advantage for peas compared to some of these other alternatives that we'll discuss, is that planting depth deal, being able to chase moisture. So this has been a big shift so these are all winter pea varieties. Traditionally, so how you get a winter pea is you take Austrian winter pea, which has very poor grain quality for anything that we would use peas for human consumption. For any of the higher value markets, Austrian winter pea has very poor grain qualities, but it has winter hardiness. And so what you do is you take an Austrian winter pea, you keep crossing it with a spring yellow field pea or spring green field pea, and eventually you come up with some winter pea varieties that actually have desirable grain quality. And that's kind of where we finally are at now. There's a couple like this 289W is a USDA line that's been released that can go into that yellow pea quality market, and so that's been a big change is being able to have these new genetics to work with. Winter pea, the photo on the right, tends to have more branching, tends to be a little more of a robust type plant as opposed to spring pea, and that's a pretty good illustration between those two. Our spring peas, we typically get one plant per seed, whereas this winter pea, you hopefully get a little bit of growth in the fall, kind of a crown type structure here, and then branching that then comes off of that in the spring. So I mentioned we started in 09 and 10, just looking at, this is all spring pea at the time, just looking at overall adaptability. We had plots at Colby Tribune Garden and down at Bushland, Texas. And so, and some of those, of course, if you remember, or many of us are still trying to forget 2011 and 2012, those are some pretty tough years to try and grow anything, especially something new, and especially at Garden City and Bushland, in terms of drought and heat that we had in those years. Some key findings out of this work. This is a summary of the data out of Tribune. Basically what we saw when we came around comparing fallow versus where we'd grown peas in that fallow period, basically the field peas were using about 3.5 inches more water than what we would have lost out of fallow anyways. And so this, if you look at what we're looking at here, is water use at different points in time after we planted these peas. And you'll notice I have a water use on fallow, and that's essentially how much of the water, how much of the rain we received did we lose out of the system. And so at the time pea harvest rolled around, we had lost essentially 5.9 inches of water out of the fallow system, and we had removed 9.3 inches of water out of the peas. The difference is we'd grown a crop here. And so, that's really the game that we're trying to play, is can we, some of this 6 inches of water we would have lost anyways, can we convert some of that to grain? So when we came around to wheat planting time, we want to look at how much water did we have in the profile, because that's a pretty good indicator of what wheat yield potential is. So this is just one example I pulled out. So in the no-till fallow, this is a fairly wet year. We had 12 inches in the no-till fallow. That's essentially a full profile. Where we'd grown the peas full season, we had about 10 inches. And then I haven't said a whole lot about safflower. We had about 7 inches, so about a 45% reduction in profile water after safflower is compared to no-till fallow. We grew safflower as part of this study for 3 years. We really struggled with sclerotinia as a disease on it, as well as white. Sclerotinia was the main issue. We had some real challenges with safflower, just really hard on the ground. I would compare it, it's got a rooting pattern and a root water extraction pattern very similar to sunflower. Has very low levels of surface residue left after you harvest it, and so really it causes some pretty negative effects on our rotations. And then about the time this study was ending, that market for safflower, the company went broke, the market disappeared, and so we've not revisited that. But we saw enough to give me some real concerns about safflower as a viable option as a fallow replacement crop. Here's another look, a little bit drier year. This is, our no-till fallow. We had about 8 inches of water in the profile. And then we had different terminations on the peas as if we were taking them for forage. And then if we let them go all the way full season, so we got about 8 inches in the fallow, about 5 inches after peas, and 2.5 inches in the profile after safflower. Let's move on. Yeah, and so here's just looking at water use by depth. And so the line here on the far right, this is available water at wheat planting. So this is the soil surface up here at the top, going down to the 8-foot depth. So the further the line is to the right, the more water we have. And so here's our no-till fallow. Fairly decent amount of water, especially in the top 2 feet in that profile, and then on down. Field peas being the dotted line in the middle, and then safflowers, you can see, did a very effective job at mining water to a fairly significant depth. As you'd expect, we see that show up then in our wheat yields afterwards, and so that's oftentimes our hang up is, okay, if I plant some fallow alternative, what's that going to do to my wheat crop? And so while that is important, we always got to keep a systems perspective. And what's the value of that alternative I'm growing versus the bushels of wheat yield I might be giving up, and maintaining that balance and keeping in mind we got to look at the economics of the whole system. But that being said, when we had an early termination on the peas or no-till fallow, we're raising 51, 56 bushel wheat. We let the peas go full season. We're down to 40, 44 bushel wheat, and then after safflower is 38 bushel wheat. This year in 2012, which again was a pretty tough year at Garden, was even more pronounced. So wheat into no-till fallow made 30. Our early terminated peas were kind of in here in the 17, 20 range. Peas to grain, 13, 14 bushel wheat. And then wheat after safflower came in at a whopping 4 bushel. And I will tell you that the value of safflower, even when that market was going, was not large enough to offset 26 bushel of wheat yield. Yeah, and this is an example of a really extreme case. Still seeing that show up. If we're raising 6 bushel wheat, I'm not sure we really care. But 6 bushel wheat on all these treatments versus less than a bushel after safflower. Okay, so that was kind of our first look. We've ramped that work up. We've done variety trials. We've tested stuff in a number of locations in Northwest Kansas. This is even missing a spot. We've been doing stuff. We had done some stuff over in Rooks and Republic County as well. But in general, my recommendation has been we're not really pushing them very far south of somewhere in here, Highway 4, Highway 96. Anytime we go south of there, we've just not had any success in southern Scott County or down at Garden City. And it goes back to what we was talking about on temperatures and heat. We've had slightly more success at Tribune, but I think our elevation helps us out a bit there. But again, these are a pretty cool season crop on the spring peas. So we've suspended our spring pea variety testing work, but you can see the results that we do have are up on my website. We may look at restarting those trials next year. If we look at yield for all the years we ran these trials, we look at just the top group of varieties and how they performed. Across years, Rawlins County was averaging about 35 bushel in Thomas, 37, 38 in Decatur, 33 in Gove. We had 1 year of limited irrigation trial over in Sherman County. Those made about 55, 30 over in Rooks, and then just 1 year data over in Republic, and we struggled with those. I think if we did that more years, I think they'd probably be in the 30 bushel range on a long-term average, kind of like the rest of these sites as well. So production practices, you have to know your herbicide history, check labels for anything you've used. One of the things we really got to be careful of here is mesotrione. So Lumax, Lexar, the generics that we like to use often in corn and especially sorghum. That mesotrione carryover is death on field peas, and so we really got to think through think through our herbicide program there. K-State and UNL, we both got variety performance testing results. We got seeding rate studies. Our seeding rate target needs to be around 365,000 live seed. They'll germinate at temps above 40 degrees. Basically, my guidance for folks have been, if it's the latter, last week February, first part of March, and conditions are good, it's time to go. So depth, we got a large range there. Again, want to make sure we get at least a ½ inch into moisture. Variety selection, yield stability. Know your market class and where you're going there. And again, we've got some guidelines on the web that can help with that. Weed control, you really got to dig through the labels. Randy Curry, our retired weed scientist down at Garden, always used to say dark is the best herbicide, and that's true on a lot of these alternative crops. We don't have a lot of herbicide options. Field pea is a pretty weak competitor with weeds early in the season. However, once you get canopy, it can be fairly competitive. So having a pre-emerge residual down can really move things in a positive direction if we get a good stand and a good plant canopy later on. We've got some good pre-emerge residual options, so Spartan, Metribuzin, Dual, all things that work really well in our system. Post options, really not a lot here. These are all spray and pray type scenarios, and so you really they're labeled and they can help a little bit, but we just don't want to be in that situation. We want good pre-residual, narrow row spacing, good stands, and get a canopy. Inoculation is important. Not the same soybean inoculant. Not all pulse crops, and we'll talk about this again with cowpeas, not all pulse crops use the same inoculant. So very important to understand what you're planting. This is also important if you're doing some cover crops with pulses in it and want to inoculate. Understand that there are different strains that are very much crop specific. Multiple forms on the market, liquid, peat, and granular. This is some work actually out of Canada, but there's been numerous studies look at some of these different forms. And I would tell you, we never had any formal trials, but just in my experience and working with producers, I'd say my experience very much aligns with this, that we had our highest levels of success with a dry granular type inoculant versus either a liquid or a peat dusting type product. The granular, especially in tougher years, you've got a little bit of food source there for the microbes to live on. It seems like it's got a little more lifespan in the soil before conditions are right, and it has a chance to colonize the soil around it. We already mentioned seeding rates, but yeah, this is kind of where we're into this 365,000 type recommendation. That is a higher seeding rate than what you'd see recommended to the north of us. And I think a lot of that is as you move further, as we move peas south, our conversion of yield components into grain is much more limited. We convert fewer flowers into pods, and we tend to average fewer seeds per pod than what they do in the northern plains. And so therefore it takes more plants per acre in order for us to maximize our yield potential. This is a challenge on the economics of peas. Seed costs, 365,000 seed, you're talking, depending upon seed size, roughly 3 bushel per acre, 180 pounds per acre seeding rate. And so seed cost is the largest economic factor working on the negative side of the budget for peas. And the logistical challenges. If you're seeding very many acres, that is a lot of seed to handle logistically. Seed quality is really important. Not only warm germ, but actually having a cold germ score, proper handling. Seed is fragile. We don't want to crack it. They're all important things to think about. There's some more details in here on seed testing that I'm going to skip over if you guys have more interest. It's in the handout, but in the interest of getting some of these other crops, we got some more info in here on seed testing, seed treatments. I want to mention briefly our winter pea work. We started that in 2018. This really was eye-opening. We started with a real rough data planning study, and in here we had some peas that were making in the 60 to 80 bushel range. Prior to this, the best spring peas I'd ever cut had been 40, 50 bushels. So this was really eye-opening. So we've kept dabbling with this a little bit as time and resources have allowed. We did some variety evaluation in 2019, largely with a lot of experimental lines out of USDA, and cut some 86, 88 bushel peas. That was fun. I'd like to do more of that. And so this is why you can see probably pretty quickly here why I'm thinking a lot of our work moving forward on the peas is going to be focused on the more so on the winters. 2021, we did 2 locations of testing, Rawlins County and Thomas County on dry land. Some yields up here. That was a tougher year, but still was able to pull out some 30, 40 bushel type winter pea yields. We've had some trials where we've looked at winter peas and spring peas side by side. This is part of a rotation study. So this is in a wheat-corn-fallow rotation here at Colby. We had 5 different varieties, what we thought were our 5 best spring peas, and then our 5 best winter peas. So in 2019, in this side-by-side comparison, we're basically pushing 80 on the winters while we're making 55 with the springs. And so that's been a fairly common deal. And if you think about it, it's not that surprising, right? We know winter wheat does better than spring wheat. Winter canola does better than spring canola. Winter barley does better than spring barley. Anytime we've got a winter versus spring option, winter trip, spring trip, the winter version tends to do better in our environment. This is a much lower yield environment, 2020, but and we did actually in this situation see the springs beat out the winters, but this had more to do with just the timing of stress that year. I think this is more the outlier than it is normal. Picking up one of the questions here, a question about pH. So on the field peas, our experience has been significantly less sensitivity to high pH than soybeans, and that's true really for peas and then our other dry beans. So if we think about pintos, or we'll talk about black eyeds here in a little bit, and field peas, those all typically are a lot less sensitive to high pH as what soybeans are. Good question. Okay, so yeah, this is just running behind on time. We're going to we're continue to do work on peas. And I always include this photo because I joke sometimes we're doing research. We actually have a photo of Springfield peas here at the Colby station in 1915. So, but obviously things have changed. All right, shifting gears to spring wheat is another option. So this is something else we've been looking at in recent years. This is a photo from one of our trial sites over in Rooks County on a cooperator we've been working with over there. Spring wheat's been looked at a number of times at Colby in Northwest Kansas in the past years. So actually from 1915 through 1950, there was a continuous trial looking at winter wheat versus spring wheat here at Colby. And that was in the context of a fallow system, though. That was after fallow. But in that scenario, spring wheat was averaging about less than half of winter wheat. Rob Aiken revisited it here in 01 through 05. Again, about 50% revisited, and then we started looking at it again in 2019. Our first year of that trial was on fallow ground, and it made about 43%. But what if we think about why would someone do that? And it's, well, again, we got to think about the system, and we're not really thinking about putting spring wheat on fallow. But we look at the economics that's driving this. This is as of yesterday at Cornerstone and Colby. About a 77-cent differential right now between spring and winter. When I updated this number, the number here before was 87 cents. I know some guys, doing on-farm storage and accessing some other markets, I think have got some connections, have been able to put together some spreads even wider than that. So we look at the economics of this, along with, can we stick spring wheat in as a fallow alternative and kick that fallow cost out? The spring wheat doesn't have to make as good as the winter wheat. We just have to improve the economics of the whole rotation. We know when we started this, there was a big question about quality, and I didn't get this slide updated. So in all the years we've been running the variety trial, we've been sending samples off to Ardent Mills in Denver. They've been running mills and bakes for us, and really the qualities have been coming back that are good enough to make it usable as marketable as spring wheat. Keep in mind, spring wheat is a different market class than hard red winter wheat. Cannot be blended. It is wheat out of class. However, white is a different story. White wheat does not differentiate between winter and spring, so those actually can be put together. So here's examples, some yields. Again, this is our first year. This is into fallow. We had spring wheat yields ranging from 37 to 56 bushel. And that was a spring that was pretty conducive to spring wheat. And then we needed, we said we got to do this the same way everyone else is doing it. So we went to, no-tilling it back into fresh row crop stocks. This is 2020. No-tilled into fresh stocks here at Colby. Yields ranging from about 19 to 24 bushels. And I think that's pretty in line with what other people were observing. We have seen some consistency in some of the varieties that rise to the top. So there's 2020, Thomas County. This is across, and this is on the website. If you'd like to look at this is looking at yields across all of our site years. So we got 3 years of data in Thomas County, 2 years in Rooks County. We suspended testing last year. This was really being funded by the seed companies entering their varieties in this test. And I don't know. I don't think they felt like they was getting enough sales of seed, and so they'd kind of stepped away. And we may try and revisit this next year. But at the moment, we've kind of put this work on pause. But that data is on the site of all the varieties that we've looked at and kind of how they came out yield wise. This West Bred 9590 LCS Cannon have pretty consistently been towards the top. 9719 has looked decent out of West Bred as well. Seeding rate, we've done 3 site years of seeding rate work. It's a remarkably flat response. Our colleagues in Nebraska have been running some similar trials, and as far as I know, they're not finding anything real different. So we're not seeing a huge response, but again, at these types of yield levels, probably not really going to see it. My thought was, spring wheat just doesn't tiller as much. There's not that opportunity for tillering, so maybe we need more plants out there to capture our yield potential, but at least for the yields we're talking, it's been a fairly flat response to seeding rate. That said, I'm still not very comfortable with us being less than. I still think we need to kind of be in this 1.1 to 1.5 million. I think we're playing with some risk if we get down here on this 0.7 or 700 to 900,000. Okay, switching gears again to cowpeas. Heat and drought tolerant, native to Africa, relatively low water use crop, and very short duration crop. And so somewhat unintentionally, so this is work that Jeannie Falk and I have been doing. Getting a hold of seed in a timely manner has been a real challenge the last couple of years. So our field peas unintentionally been planted pretty late. But we've still seen some really successful yields, which has been exciting. So we're looking at this a couple different ways. One of the things we're doing, so down at Tribune, these are our large scale dryland rotation plots. This study was started in 1993. We're evaluating all sorts of rotations. I had an extra wheat sorghum fallow slot in there, and so we're taking that and converting it to wheat sorghum cowpea. So we'll actually have wheat sorghum cowpea versus wheat sorghum fallow. And then of course we also have wheat corn fallow, wheat corn sorghum fallow, wheat sorghum corn fallow, continuous sorghum wheat fallow. I think there's about 6 different rotations that we have in this study. So I just said this. We only got 1 year of data. We had them out this last year. The cowpeas averaged about 1,000 pounds per acre. They were planted later than we'd like. I think it's about June 23rd we got them in. We harvested them on about the 26th of September. We harvested them in the afternoon, drilled it right back to wheat the next morning. So we got the wheat back in on time. And so we'll see how things do. We did use some water. So this is profile water at wheat planting. So we've got, in most of our rotations where we're coming in after a fallow, after a row crop, we got somewhere between about 6 3/4 and 7.5 inches of profile water. Where we had just grown the cowpeas, we're sitting at about 3.7 inches. So historically, based on this difference in water, in general, we'd expect about 10 bushel less of wheat yield potential this coming summer. So we'll see what happens. It is using that water at some depths. So this is all of our other treatments. Again, this is at wheat planting. This is how much water we have versus depth. Notice that the long fallow and wheat fallow really isn't any better than anything else. Actually, we got slightly more water in our wheat-corn-fallow, but you can see the wheat, sorghum, cowpea here, less water at these various depths. Now, again, that cowpea was planted pretty late. If we get it planted that last week of May, first week of June, which I think would be a little more optimal, that crop would get finished up a little sooner and maybe open us up a window for a couple weeks there to catch some rain and recharge the profile a little bit. We've done variety trials at Colby last year, both irrigated and dry land. So on the top end of the irrigated, making about 2,500 pounds per acre. On the dry land side, right around this 1,800 to 2,000 mark. So really impressed with the yields. These plots actually are planted on the 4th of July. So really late, but still managed to get some really nice productivity out of them. We're looking at seeding rates. On the dry land side, we looking like we need to be somewhere around that 70,000 seeds per acre in order to maximize yields. Again, just 1 year data. This is all on 10-inch row spacing. We're drilling these. On the irrigated side, not as steep of a response, but basically hitting that break point somewhere around 100, probably around that 115, 120,000 mark is where we need to be on that. We've looked at inoculation and nitrogen rates. We've done a wide variety of treatments there. Not a lot of data yet, but in general, we don't really have anything to make real solid recommendations out of. I think what we're going to see a lot of time with the cowpeas as a fallow alternative is we're going to be able to use some of that leftover nitrogen from the prior crop. And so I don't know that we're going to be in a position to where we need to be really fertilizing this crop very, very intensively, but we're going to continue looking at this. We're going to continue doing some work in variety testing, looking at some broader genetics. This last year, we had 171 different genetic lines that we evaluated, mostly just increasing seed. A lot of these we started, I only had 25 seed to start with, and so it's really just about growing seed this year so that we can do more plots in the future. Going to mention camelina real quick. There's a lot of discussion on it. So if you're not familiar, it's an oilseed crop in the Nebraska family. Interestingly, was an important oil crop in Europe prior to World War II, was grown throughout Europe. This causes a lot of confusion. There's both winter and spring types out there. And if you're working with a company, need to have, or you're thinking about this, need to make sure you have an understanding of the varieties that you're accessing and whether they're a winter or a spring type. They're a fairly short season crop, 70 to 100 days. Actually, some of the work that's been done at Kansas puts it closer to this 70 mark, at least with the varieties that Augustine was looking at. And we've got a couple of key markets. The big thing pushing this right now is biodiesel and jet fuel and some of the federal requirements and federal tax rebate programs that are really driving this industry of trying to raise camelina for these markets. You may ask, why camelina? Why not canola? The difference there is that canola is very much considered a food crop, whereas camelina is considered an industrial oil. And so in the way these things are scored from a sustainability or carbon intensity score standpoint, canola gets hit hard in that score because you're taking a crop that's got human food potential and are using it for industrial purposes. Whereas camelina is primarily an industrial oil to begin with, so it scores better on some of these different metrics. That said, though, there is an emerging human market for camelina due to its high omega-3 fatty acid content and some of the reported health benefits surrounding that. So this is some work done at Hayes looking at planting dates. And so Augustine's really our camelina expert. He's worked on it both in Wyoming and at Hayes. We've had some plots here at Colby with Augustine as well. His recommendation for us is for winter camelina, we need to be planting it somewhere between the 5th of September and the 5th of October. Spring types, February 15 through April 1. That said, there is a lot of discussion about frost seeding camelina, and I think that concept has merit. We've also talked about that with spring wheat and a little bit on spring pea. If we've got some good conditions, and especially if it's dry and we know we're going to be waiting on moisture, maybe there's some benefit to frost seeding that, getting it laid in there, and then it's there and wet and ready when the moisture comes and the temperatures rise enough to get it done. here's 3 different years looking at early, mid, and late planting. Here's the flip side of that, though, is Augustine's data actually showed a little bit higher yields from that April planting. So I don't know if that's more of a stand establishment type issue or what's really driving that. But a couple of these years also had some fairly cool springs, which helps it out as well. Okay, I borrowed this from one of the production guides that's available out there. So, firm seed bed, it's really, I did not get a picture into the seed. It's really tiny seed. It's got to be shallow seeded, which are challenges for us. Again, back to dormant seeding, very seldom can we actually lay it into moisture at shallow depth, but if it's in there and ready for moisture, we might be better off. Nitrogen, some other work Augustine's done showing 20 to 40 pounds of N has been where we need to be to maximize yields. We want to keep narrow row spacing. Again, there's not a lot of good herbicides for camelina. And so getting a solid stand, getting that crop canopy established quickly is going to be really important to maintaining weed control. And timely harvest, prone to shattering. When it's ready, we got to be there to get it. There's a couple guides out there. Colorado State University has an extension pub. You can Google to get at that. Blue Sun Energy, Charlie Reif, who used to be a canola breeder at K-State, who now works for Blue Sun, they put out a spring camelina production guide that you can find. And then, as I mentioned, Augustine O'Bour, our soil scientist at Hays, really is the expert on camelina here in the High Plains. A little bit about winter canola, renewed interest in that. Basically our biggest challenge with canola on dry land is with winter canola, we really need to be seeding it, somewhere for us, probably around that 10th of September, typically 2 weeks ahead of your optimal date for wheat. And it's tough for us in that time period in dry land to actually plant seed 3/4 of an inch deep and be into moisture. And so that's something we're always going to struggle with for winter canola. And that timing is important, because if we plant it too early, it can get too big, too rank. That hurts winter survivability. Plant it too late, it doesn't get big enough, and again, hurts winter survivability. And so we've got, for winter canola, we really got that sweet spot we're needing to hit, and the stars just doesn't always align with being able to shallow seed into moisture in that time period. But anyways, we've had some decent yields here on winter canola. Granted, this has been under irrigation, so we've been able to put some water on it to get uniform stand. We get some question on spring oil seeds, spring canola. Rob Aiken had done some work on that here at Kobe in the early 2000s. And like we was talking to spring peas, we just really get nailed with that heat at flowering and fill. And so not only does it hurt yield, but it also hurts oil content. And so just the variability in those numbers, really some pretty poor yields at times and pretty poor oil contents. I really struggle believing that our spring oil seeds have much of a future here in this part of the world, at least with the current genetics. Okay, I had some more slides, but this is going to be a good breaking point. Where we also looked at some more intensified rotations, and that's always another option. Is rather than an alternative crop, do I stack another row crop in? Do I go wheat, sorghum, sorghum fallow? Do I go wheat, wheat, sorghum fallow? And so we had that presentation up at Cover Your Acres. We've got that proceedings book online if you want to look at some of that, or actually we got the recording of that. I should try and get that put online. So, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip those and get to my summary slide here. Which is more slides away than I realized. Basically, I can sum this up though. The take-home message is anytime that we stack row crop, and we've got basically over 30 years of data on this out of multiple studies. Anytime we stack row crop after row crop, that second year row crop makes basically 2/3, 66 to 70% of what row crop into wheat stubble makes that same year. Okay. And even when we do something like continuous sorghum, it makes about 2/3 of what sorghum into wheat stubble makes. And so that's, that's a pretty good number to use for some back of the envelope economics. And then we've done some work looking at, obviously, if we're sitting with I think one of the things to keep in mind is if we're at planting time and we got a full profile, life doesn't get any better than that. We probably should plant something. And so, but in general, when we're recropping row crop, we're making about 2/3 of row crop into wheat stubble. And that's been amazingly consistent through time and across various rotations where we've tried that. Okay, so concluding thoughts. What I just mentioned, I think we need to be more dynamic, more opportunistic in our cropping systems. I'm sitting here May 15th. I've got, if I've got a full profile water, I probably should do something with it. Or even on March 1, if I'm sitting there with a full profile water, maybe I should do something with that. Again, in dryland cropping, life does not get better than a full profile. What's my surface residue condition? My point here is if you've got a pretty bare soil condition, the prior crop was a near failure. Yeah, we know that we need residue if we're going to recrop that, we know we need residue is going to help whatever crop we might plant. But the fact that we're near bare condition also means our fallow efficiency, our ability to store water, is going to be very poor. And so the lower the residue, so if I'm sitting in a scenario where I've got no surface residue or poor surface residue, it was dry last year, I failed the crop, but I've gotten a lot of moisture over winter. So I'm sitting there with no surface residue and a full profile. Absolutely, that's the time to put a crop out there, right? And so, because all you're going to do is lose water from that point forward. We need to make decisions that improve precipitation use efficiency. So we still, even though, will we ever completely eliminate fallow from our systems? I don't know. I think fallow still has some places as a risk management tool. If crop insurance would ever go away, I think that really changes that dynamic. But if we do still have fallow in the system, we need to do good management, maintain residue, no-till. But then, system intensification. Can we intensify with cash crops, either alternatives or intensify with our more common crops? So striking that balance of intensifying the system, but also keep in mind to do no harm. We know in our environment, there's a hit on subsequent crops that's going to reduce surface residue. And if we push too hard and we get hit with a couple of years of bad weather, as y'all know, that can put us into a death spiral pretty quick. Less residue, less productivity, and it doesn't just take an average year; it takes an above average year to pull us back out of that. So, anyways, I'm sorry I've went several minutes over time, but that's where we're at here. I see a couple questions, so we'll go right to those.
Address that, let me say here, please, if you can, help us out by completing the evaluation. You can either scan the QR code that's up or click on the link that will be put in the chat. And there again, if you have a certified crop advisor's license, you can scan the QR code here, or if you email Jeannie Falk Jones, email her again here at the end. And then please, if you have any additional questions, put them in the Q&A or the chat, and Lucas will get those answered.
Yeah, so a couple good ones here. Residue behind cowpeas. Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, and we didn't quantify it, we didn't measure it or anything, but just observationally, certainly better than our residue after field peas has been. And I would tell you, combining them, I mean, it's a tougher material. It's a little stringier, a little tougher, even going through the machine. And so I think it's going to be a little more a more durable residue in terms of lasting. But no, it's not a great situation. There's a lot of there's just not a lot of biomass there to start with. And so when we come back around to wheat drilling time, I do like our residue condition after the cowpeas better than field peas. It'd be better than soybeans, certainly also, I think. Certainly not comparable to, corn residue, sorghum, or wheat stubble, obviously. But in terms of comparing it to other broadleaves, I think the cowpeas is as good or better than any of our other broadleaf options. Stripper head harvest on the cowpeas. We've not tested that. I wanted to test it this year, and we didn't get around to that. But I talked to a grower over in eastern Colorado who tried running stripper head on one, and it was not good. There's just too many splits. And then of course that's your biggest dockage factor on them is splits. And so I don't know that that's going to be a viable option. along with that, so they set the pods high enough. They can be direct harvested. A flex draper really would be the optimal way to cut those. At Tribune, we used just a regular straight platform and got along really well with that also. We at Colby, we tried with a flex head, not a flex draper. That was a disaster. That did not work well because in a straight flex head, you got more distance between the cutter bar and the cross auger, and stuff would just pile up there. So either a conventional platform or really a flex draper would be ideal. Spring barley versus spring wheat. We've not. Well, I take that back. We've grown some spring barley. I didn't show that data. That was along with spring wheat. We threw in a couple spring barleys at the request of a seed company. They were actually looking at it from a malting. They were malt barley varieties, and actually performed quite well. Yeah, the comment was about feeding. Certainly have good feed value to it, and we can grow spring barley here. Guys have done it commercially and stripped it with stripper head. Have told me they like the barley stubble better than wheat stubble. But yeah, if you've got a use for it on farm, I think it's a viable option. I know guys, we've had some folks in Thomas County do it. We've had some folks over in Phillips County do it. The problem's always has been getting a market. And a lot of that's, been hauled to the dairies in New Mexico over the years. And by the time you get the freight in it, there wasn't much money left. Which of the crops mentioned are most optimistic as a fallow replacement? At the moment, and maybe it's just the newness factor of it, but what I've seen with the cowpeas has really impressed me. And the winter pea, I still think has some opportunities for us, and spring wheat as well. I mean, that's probably the easiest one. That's the lowest hanging fruit. I mean, that's the one that doesn't really require a whole lot of special effort out versus what guys are already doing. I think the spring wheat deal. Granted, we got the terminal here in Colby, but for the guys that are further away, if you have some on-farm storage and the interest and the ability to market that directly to some of the mills, I think there's some opportunities there. So spring wheat, winter pea, and cowpea, I guess, are the ones. I think camelina's got some real challenges. We don't have a lot of good weed control options. Very little in the way of herbicide options. Any of these small seeded crops that we got to plant shallow, getting a stand is one of your biggest challenges. And if you don't get a stand, then you got a weed control problem. Winter peas harvested. They've been coming off. It depends a lot on the year. But basically we're coming off with those about the same time as wheat, about the same time as winter wheat. Sometimes maybe a little later than the spring pea, but it's also been earlier than spring pea. So I guess I shouldn't say that. But in general, about the same time as wheat. But of course, if you got peas out, we gotta want to go cut those first. Certainly more prone to shatter than what we're used to in our other crops. Trying to think if there was anything other crops that we've been asked about or other stuff we've looked at. I think we've looked at hemp, and I'd say that's not in the running either for a viable option. So
Aaron, is there anything from YouTube question wise?
No questions on YouTube at the time.
Yeah, so a couple more questions. Winter peas. So that market's really emerging. Basically they're going into a lot of the same markets as where our spring peas have went, and so a lot of that's going for human consumption or for protein extraction. And so, for example, up at Hastings, Nebraska, they got a splitting facility there where peas are being split, and then a lot of those go to export for human consumption. And then, the pet food market, when we first started on the spring peas, Kansas has a pretty active pet food industry in the eastern part of the state. There's a number of pet food plants, and they had become a really important market for our peas. And then there was a quack study come out that was blaming grains and specifically peas for, I forget the name of it, but some ailment in dogs. And that basically killed the pet food thing overnight. That's since been disproven by several several subsequent studies, and that's a big focus in the pea and lentil, or the pea industry right now, is to try and go out and do some education and get peas reincorporated as an input in the pet food industry. And so we're hoping to see that come back, because that really was a great market opportunity for us in Kansas, because we had such an advantage in that market just from a freight standpoint, because they could buy peas from Western Kansas and still be dollars and dollars ahead versus out of freighting them down out of the Dakotas. So there's a few options there. Millets, yeah. Certainly as we move further west in the area, we see a lot of proso come into the mix, and there's a lot of things I like about proso millet agronomically. It's a great crop for us. I think it can fit really well as a fallow alternative, or depending upon if you want to switch that rotation up, maybe do less wheat, maybe proso corn or something like that. The biggest challenge with millet is the market volatility, and we can see that stuff go from being worth $25 a bushel to $3 a bushel in pretty short time. And so delivery points are a challenge. Schooler at Goodland does take it, but the market volatility is a real challenge there. Agronomically, it's got a lot of potential for us, and especially traditionally it's been swathed and picked up. But stripper head is an option in millet, and you have a little more loss on the ground, but I think what we gain in residue and what it does for the next crop outweighs that. So no, I think proso has a fit. K-State's doing a little bit of work in pearl millet. There's just not a real strong market for that grain. There's some market for it as a forage. So I don't know really where we're going with that. I think it's got a longer road ahead of it. Could you put winter wheat in behind spring wheat? Yeah, I think winter behind spring would be okay. Spring behind winter would concern me a little more, because you'd have some potential for some volunteer issues in there. But winter behind spring, I think would work, Ward. Cow peas and herbicide plant back restrictions. That's a good question. What I would tell you at Tribune, so in that sorghum, we did not, at the time, 2 years ago, we didn't know we was going to plant cow peas. So that sorghum had Lumax on it, full rate of Lumax. So by label, we should have been in danger planting that to cow peas this spring. That said, I did not see injury in those cow peas. And so, yeah, you do got to watch those plant back restrictions. I would tell you field peas, I feel like, are the most sensitive to that mesotrione piece. And it does not take much to really light up the field peas. But cow peas, that's a good question. And I don't have as good a feel for it yet, but that one observation, we did not see mesotrione show up in the cow peas this past year when we would have been within that window. Some of that is on these herbicide labels. Some of it is these companies don't run all these trials on all these crops. It basically gets down to, well, we're going to put 18 months on it and cover our rears, is basically the approach they're taking on some of these labels. But some of them are a problem. Mesotrione is one we got to watch. And it's worse than our other HPPDs. We see a lot more carryover issues with mesotrione than we do, say, the active ingredients in Balance Flex or Lotus or some of those other HPPD products out on the market. Herbicides over time, associated water pollution. What can we do to mitigate pollution, mainly in least developed countries? Yeah, so I guess I'm not exactly sure how to address that when I think about, in our environment. Fortunately, we don't get enough rainfall here. It's difficult for us to move herbicide off target. But again, anything we can do to keep, if we think just broad principles, anything we can do to improve infiltration, get the water going into the soil versus running across it, good traditional conservation measures, contour farming, terracing, maintaining residue. I think those are all things that are important to keeping the water and any herbicides that might be dissolved in that water on the land.